its excellence by scholars, politicians, critics, and the public at large. The first volume of this trilogy, The Path to Power, won the National Book Critics Circle Award as the best nonfiction work of 1982. The second volume, Means of Ascent, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for 1990. And the third volume, Master of the Senate, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, is a finalist for a National Book Award in the nonfiction category. The winner will be announced November 20th, and I'm sure you join me in wishing Mr. Caro well. Time does not allow mentioning even a fraction of Mr. Caro's many talents and accomplishments, but I would like to comment on Mr. Caro's writing style, because it is absolutely brilliant. Even for those of us who lived through the LBJ years and know most of what happened during this era, this engaging biography brings all the events alive in such a readable way that I strongly advise against picking up a volume unless you can get lost in reading for a while. I can assure you that you won't put it down easily. Mr. Caro, a Princeton graduate, spent 6 years as an award-winning investigative reporter for Newsday. To research the years of Lyndon B. Johnson, Mr. Caro and Ina, who is his research assistant and his wife, moved to the Texas Hill Country. He spent years examining documents of Lyndon B. Johnson at the Presidential Library and interviewing people who had some connection to Johnson's life. For the third volume, Mr. Caro spent weeks in the United States Senate, talking to hundreds of people so that he could possibly accurately present this critical period in Johnson's career. Though I could go on about Mr. Caro, I suspect that you came here today to hear him speak about his own work. So at this time, I would like to ask you to give a warm welcome to Robert A. Caro.
Well, when my first book on Lyndon Johnson came out, let's see, is this okay? When my first book on Lyndon Johnson came out in 1982, I remember I gave a talk in Texas where I said that I was always much more happy writing than speaking, that I was always more comfortable at my desk with my typewriter than standing up talking in public. And I told a story about a young rabbi. And I'm going to repeat it today because I still feel the same way, although I've given a lot of talks since then. There was this young rabbi, Jewish like me, who just has graduated from rabbinical school, and he's assigned as his first assignment to be the assistant rabbi at a large metropolitan congregation. And after about a month, the senior rabbi says, next Friday night, you're going to give your first sermon. And the young rabbi says, well, you know, I have to tell you, I always get very nervous when I have to speak in public. Do you have any advice for me? And the older rabbi says, well, you know, you're allowed to have a water glass up there on the pulpit with you, and I find it helps if I fill it with a dry martini. And the young rabbi takes the advice and gives the sermon, and after the sermon, he hurries to the back of the synagogue, and he says to the older rabbi, well, how'd I do? The older rabbi says, well, I have 3 comments to make. He says, first of all, when I told you you could fill that water glass with a martini and have it up on the pulpit in front of the whole congregation, I didn't mean you should leave the olives in it. And he said, second, I suggested that you sip the martini at crucial points in your sermon, not drink the entire thing in one huge gulp at the beginning. And third, David slew Goliath. He didn't beat the shit out of him. Having said that, however, this talk this afternoon is one I'm really happy to give. For one thing, it's really fitting to talk in here because when Lyndon Johnson was a young boy, his father, who was a member of the House, used to bring him to this very room. And Lyndon always had the habit, which he learned from his father. His father on the floor would always put that hand around the shoulder and grab the lapel. And Lyndon Johnson started doing that when he was still a boy. And I'm also happy because if I'm here speaking, that must mean that my book tour is over. And let me just try to arrange this a little better. Can you all hear me now? This okay? No? Okay. Can you all hear me now? How about now? Okay. Then my book tour must be over, and that's something to be happy about. And it's trying to decide what to talk about this evening. I had a chance to think back over the book the last couple of days and think about some of the things that I had learned during the course of it and that I had really forgotten during the years, and that I'm really happy to have a chance to remember. One of the things I had forgotten, and it's what I'm going to talk about tonight, was my attempt to examine Lyndon Johnson's career in the Senate. And that is really the reason that my book grew and grew till it became so long, and in fact, the number of books in my biography had to change. You know what Winston Churchill said when they asked him how he was coming on his biography of Lord Marlborough? He said, "I'm working on the 4th of a projected 3 volumes." Well, I'm not to compare myself with Churchill, but I'm in the same boat. So really this talk this afternoon is about how I got there. From the beginning of my work on Lyndon Johnson, of course, I always knew that the section dealing with his 12 years in the United States Senate would be not only about Johnson, but would also be a study of legislative power. All my books are really about political power in one form or another. I was never interested in writing a biography just to tell a story of a famous man. I never had any interest in doing that at all. From the very first time I thought of writing a biography of Robert Moses, I thought of biography as a means of illuminating the times of the person that I was writing about and the great forces that shaped those times, particularly the force that is political power, because that's the force that shapes all our lives. To do that, of course, you have to pick the right guy. I picked Robert Moses because we're taught that in college and high school that in a democracy, the basis of political power, including urban political power, Robert Moses's power, comes from the ballot box, from being elected. And yet Robert Moses was never elected to anything. And he had more power in New York State and New York City than anyone who was elected, any governor or any mayor. Any governor and mayor combined. And he held that power for 44 years, almost half a century. So I felt that if I could show the basis of Robert Moses's power, I would be showing what urban power, urban political power, power in cities, consisted of, not in theory, but in reality. I'd be showing not its trappings, but its essence. I'd be showing the raw reality of what power really is. After Robert Moses, I wanted to try to examine national political power through Lyndon Johnson. What first caught my interest about Johnson were his 6 years, 1955 through 1960, in the United States Senate. He was in the Senate for 12 years, I should say, 1949 through 1960, and he was Majority Leader for 6 years. I'm going to just try one more time to get this microphone. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can't. Okay. Can I tilt it up like this? Okay. The first, as I was saying, what really caught my attention was the fact that in the whole 20th century, almost the only time that the Senate worked was the 6 years that Lyndon Johnson was Majority Leader. By worked, I mean the Senate was the center of governmental energy and creativity and ingenuity the way the Founding Fathers had intended it. When Lyndon Johnson became leader, the theory, it wasn't just a theory, it was said so often, it was written in magazines, it was written in books. It became almost a cliche that the Senate couldn't work, that the Senate just didn't work the way the Founding Fathers had intended it to, that leaders had no power, that the Senate could never be led. But Lyndon Johnson led the Senate. He controlled it. He dominated it. So I felt that if I could find out how he did that, how he and he alone made it work, that would be a way of understanding legislative power, not in theory, but in reality. In this country, we think of national political power mostly in terms of presidential or executive power. But of course, that's not what the Founding Fathers intended, since in the Constitution, they gave such great powers to Congress. And it hardly needs saying that that's not the reality either, as everyone here can understand, because just because the president proposes a law, it doesn't become a law until Congress, including the Senate, passes it. When I first thought of Johnson's Senate years and what I wanted to do with them, however, what I had in mind was something much shorter than what finally emerged. And that is in part because not long after I began working on this book, Master of the Senate, I realized it had to be about something in addition to Lyndon Johnson and in addition to legislative power. And I still remember quite clearly the moment that that happened. I've been doing what I always do at the start of a book, which is trying to get a feel of the place I'm writing about. You just hang around and try and learn about its customs and its mores, its moods and its atmosphere, just see what it's like. I was doing that. I would hang around the committee rooms, I would walk the corridors of the Senate office buildings, and I would watch it on C-SPAN, and then I would go and sit in the gallery of the Senate chamber. I would sometimes sit there all day. You know, I would be there, the Senate would be droning away with its rituals on the floor. Every once in a while, a group of tourists would come in, they'd sit for 10 minutes and be herded out. When there was a big moment, a dramatic or significant moment, the press corps would come running into the press gallery, and then when it was over, they would leave. But often, with the exception of a wire service reporter, I was the only person in the gallery watching the Senate. I sometimes felt as if the Senate was putting on a show just for me. And I thought it was not a very impressive show. I don't know what the Senate looks like to you if you see it on C-SPAN, but to me, you know, now the walls have been draped in blue to look better on television, and the chamber has been lit brightly for television. But then it was the same dim, gloomy, faded place that it had always been. I was particularly not impressed by the desks. I don't know what the desks look like to you, but to me, they looked too small for the men who were standing at them, and they looked sort of spindly, like school children's desks. But the thing was, I had never been down on the floor of the Senate. It was very hard to get a pass for an outsider to go down on the floor, but I finally got one. And after some months, I finally got my pass. I went down on the floor, and I still remember the day that happened. I walked in the door on the left side of the chamber, and I walked down between the rows of desks, down these stairs, into the well, which is at the bottom of the dais, between the desks and the dais. And when I got to the well, I turned around, and for the first time, I looked at the desks of the Senate from the well of the Senate. And in that moment, everything that I had planned to do with the book changed. Because, you know, from up above, the desks of the Senate look very small and spindly. That's not at all what they look like from the well of the Senate. The desks are arranged in 4 long semicircles. They're really arcs around the well. And when you're standing there, the desks of each of these 4 arcs blend together so that they're one arc and they're 4 arcs rising away from you in shallow tiers. The wood of the desks is a very beautiful reddish-brown mahogany, and of course they're polished and burnished every day until they gleam and glow in the lights from the ceiling above. So when you're standing there, you're suddenly surrounded by 4 gleaming arcs that stretch away from you and up from you. And my idea that it really was a scene that in that gloomy chamber was very powerful and majestic. And suddenly I had the thought, Daniel Webster stood at one of those desks. Now, of course, I knew that. We all knew it. We studied it in high school and college. In fact, at Princeton, I actually wrote a paper on Daniel Webster. But suddenly, in that moment, whatever the reason, and I really can't honestly recreate my thought processes, but the fact that I realized that fact wasn't academic to me anymore. And I remembered what I had learned in college, that when Daniel Webster spoke in the Senate, his hand always rested flat on the desk, how he never moved as he spoke. During the 30 years that he was fighting to save the Union and stave off a civil war with his compromises. Black Dan Webster, with his jutting black eyebrows and his jet black hair. Webster, whose voice, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, could shake the world. You know, Emerson called Webster a great cannon loaded to the lips for liberty. And I remembered how he stood there immobile, and whatever I felt that day was sort of solidified in my mind the next time I went back to New York and went jogging. Now, I live on Central Park West and 69th Street, so I go into Central Park in the 69th Street entrance, and almost immediately you turn to your left and start jogging up toward the reservoir. And as soon as you do that, almost the first thing that you see is this great statue of Daniel Webster, and on the pedestal are engraved in bronze, the words, "Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable." We all learned about that speech. It's called Webster's Second Reply to Hayne. It was given January 26, 1830. And Emerson said of it, no speech in the English language, perhaps no speech in modern times, had ever been as widely distributed and widely read as Webster's Second Reply to Hayne. You know, it was reprinted. There were edition after edition. In the western states, copies ran out and it was passed from hand to hand. It was said that in Tennessee, 50 people read each copy of that speech. Emerson said that it was that speech that made the Union part of the religion of this people, that enshrined the Union in the people's heart. And those last great 9 words, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable, those words would be memorized by generations of school children. They would be chiseled in marble on walls and monuments. Those words that were spoken in the Senate, among the desks of the Senate. Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, fighting for 30 years in the Senate to save the Union. Sometimes Webster and Clay together against Calhoun, sometimes all 3 of them working together on their compromises. You know, Clay didn't stand still when he spoke. He was the most charming of men. They used to say that the white gloves of Washington dinner party hostesses that he kissed, they treasured as lifelong mementos. He was this great speaker. When he was a young lawyer, they said Henry Clay can hypnotize a jury, and sometimes it seemed as if he was hypnotizing the Senate. He would stroll casually back and forth down the aisles. He had this big handkerchief which he would take out and flourish for emphasis. He always carried a snuff box. When he wanted to emphasize a point, he'd tap it to emphasize the point. When he wanted to have a dramatic pause, he'd stop and take a sniff of snuff. And he was tall, he was slender and graceful. Calhoun, of course, he stalked among those desks, they said, like a caged lion, because Calhoun knew he was losing. He knew that his beloved South was losing. Well, these 3 men, Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, were the most famous Americans of their time. They were the people that people came from Europe and from all over the country to see. They were not presidents, they were senators. And the Senate of the United States was the balance wheel of government at that time. I don't know really how much else I thought of that day. I'm sure I didn't think of it all at once. Had to learn it again, because if I ever learned, remembered what I learned in school, I had long forgotten it. But over the next few months, I learned more and more about the desks of the Senate, how it was under one of those desks that Charles Sumner's legs were caught, so he was beaten almost to death. Sumner, the great abolitionist, was giving a speech against slavery when a representative from South Carolina came in behind him in the Senate with a heavy cane, struck him on the head and knocked him down. And because Sumner couldn't get his legs out from under the desk, he had to lay there while he was beaten about the head and almost killed, while another representative from South Carolina stood there with a cane to hold back the rest of the Senate. you know, when Sumner died, years later, he recovered, he came back to the Senate. When he died years later, his body was brought back to Boston for burial on a funeral train, and all along the route, church bells tolled. When it got to Boston, the governor and the mayor and a delegation of prominent citizens had come to the station to escort the casket to the church for burial. But around the corner came a regiment, the black regiment that had fought so courageously in the war, the veterans of it. And they marched up to the casket, and they surrounded it as the casket went to the church. And on it, one of them draped the banner, a silken banner, and on the banner was engraved the words, "The Civil Rights Bill shall not die." There were a lot of glorious moments in the Senate in the 19th century. Of course, in the 20th century, the moments were mostly inglorious. It was one of those same desks that Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. stood when he and the Senate defeated the Treaty of Versailles and Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations and dealt such a blow to hopes for peace in the world. It was from those desks that the isolationists, Boer and Nye and the others, kept Franklin Roosevelt from trying to mobilize free nations against the rise of totalitarianism. The Senate became dominated by the South, and it stood for 100 years until Lyndon Johnson became majority leader as the great dam against all liberal legislation, in particular against legislation for civil rights. And I realized then, as I say, I don't think it was in one moment, and I can't really honestly recreate my process, but I realized then that if I was trying to truly examine the roots of legislative power, senatorial power for the purposes of this book, I had to try to show the Senate actually exercising its power and then losing its power. I would have to try to find out why it lost it and the consequences for America of the fact that it lost it. The Senate was created to do great things. For a while, for 100 years, it did great things. Then that stopped. Why? Why did the Senate stop working, and how did Lyndon Johnson make it work again? If I wanted to show the realities of legislative power, I had to answer those questions in this book. I wanted to show Lyndon Johnson getting power over it and transforming the Senate. I had to make the reader see what he was transforming it from. And while I didn't think of it all at once, I knew in that first moment, I think, when I stood in the well of the chamber, that this book was not going to be just about Lyndon Johnson and not just about legislative power, but about the Senate of the United States, the history of the Senate, what the Founding Fathers intended it to be when they said that each state should be equal and sovereign in it. Each state should have the same number of senators. When they said that the Senate should be independent of the power of a president. The terms of each senator would be longer, 6 years, than that of a president. When they said that it would be independent to a great extent of public opinion, because only 1/3 of the Senate would be elected in any one election, so public opinion could never get at the entire Senate at one time. When they deliberately left out of the Constitution any provision for someone to lead the Senate, to preside over the Senate. You know, the Constitution says that the House of Representatives shall have a speaker, and because the Constitution says that, the House was able to create all these rules to give them real power. But the Constitution says nothing about the leadership of the Senate except that it should be presided over by the Vice President, who shall have not even have a vote except in case of a tie. Because why would senators want to be led, since they were the representatives of sovereign states? How did Lyndon Johnson rise to power in the Senate? How did he lead it? Nothing was more remarkable about his rise than its speed. Seniority governed everything in the Senate then, to an extent we can hardly imagine today. You know, you weren't supposed to speak very much your first 2 years in the Senate. You weren't supposed to speak hardly at all in those first 2 years. You weren't supposed to speak very much in your first 6-year term. At the end of his first 2 years in the Senate, Lyndon Johnson was the assistant leader of his party. At the end of 4 years, he was the leader of his party. And 2 years later, the Democrats got the majority, and he became the majority leader. He was only 46 years old. I was trying to remember, I didn't have my book here. I think the next the average age of previous majority leaders had been 61. So he was by far the youngest majority leader in the history of the Senate. A lot of rules had been put in to make sure that no senator could lead the Senate. One of Johnson's predecessors, Alvin Barkley of Kentucky, said no one can lead it. He said, I have nothing to promise them. I have nothing to threaten them with. So how was Lyndon Johnson able to run the Senate like this? Well, it takes hundreds of pages in my book to try and explain that, so I won't go into it all this afternoon. I'll only say that probably the most significant sentence in the book that answers this question is a quote not from me, but from Lyndon Johnson talking about himself. This is Lyndon Johnson talking about himself. It's the epigraph of this book. I do understand power, whatever else may be said about me. I know where to look for it, and I know how to use it. Well, Lyndon Johnson was right in that self-assessment. In this book, he looks for power in places that no one else had thought to look for it. I have nothing to promise them, Barkley said. I have nothing to threaten them with. Johnson found things to promise them. He found things to threaten them with. He looked for it in places that no one had thought to look. I was trying to think, what's one example? There's so many in the book that I could give this afternoon. I'll just talk about Sam Rayburn. Also, since Sam Rayburn was in this very room once, that's a good thing to talk about. Rayburn, you know, ruled the House of Representatives as majority leader and speaker for 21 years. He was a figure, it's hard even to imagine a figure like that in American politics today. He was a very short man. He had immense shoulders, very broad, immense physical strength. He had this great red head, which was very completely bald. He was always embarrassed that it glistened in the television lights. He's a man of unique honesty. Despite his great power, when Rayburn died, his entire estate consisted of $15,000. He used to walk through the House of Representatives, and people would come running up to him and ask for this favor or that, and Rayburn would say yes or no. And someone once said to him, don't you need to make notes to remember what you promised? And Rayburn said, if you always tell the truth, you don't need to make notes to remember what you promised. His face was always set. He seemed never to smile. His face was always set in this very grim mask. Men were literally afraid to come up to him. They were so afraid of his temper and his power. They said that when Rayburn walked through the corridors of the House of Representatives, it was like waves breaking on a stone. People scampered to get out of his way because they didn't want to talk to him. They were afraid to talk to him. So I learned about Rayburn's power, but I also learned about his loneliness. Rayburn was a man who always wanted a big family. When he came to Washington in 1917, he wrote his sister back in Bonham that he spent his weekends driving around Washington looking for a house big enough to hold all his children. Wrote the same sister some years later, God, what I would give for a tow-headed boy to take fishing. But Rayburn never had a family. Socially, he considered himself very inept. He never liked to go to people's houses or to parties. He once said, whenever I try to tell a joke, I'm the joke. His relationships with women were very strained. He was married once for 3 weeks. No one knows what happened. I certainly don't. Never married again. So he never had children. He was a very lonely man. You know, during the week, the speaker is surrounded by people who want favors from him. But on weekends, everyone else goes home to their family. Rayburn lived alone in a little apartment in Washington. And what he used to do on weekends was walk the streets around the Capitol by himself, with his face set in that grim mask, as if he wanted to be alone, as if he was daring anyone to come up and talk to him. But I know different. I learned different because I talked to the young men who had been his assistants, and they would talk about how sometimes on weekends the loneliness would get too great for Mr. Sam, and he would telephone one of them and ask them to come down as if he had something urgent for them to do. And they'd sit in his office and watch him pull open one drawer after another, trying to find some excuse for having called them. Now, when Lyndon Johnson came to Washington as a congressman's assistant in 1931, then he married Lady Bird, and in 1934, just after they got married, they invited Sam Rayburn to their small apartment. Now, Rayburn came because he had known Lyndon's father from this same room. They had been representatives in the Texas House of Representatives together. But ordinarily, Rayburn would have come only once as a courtesy, and he would never have come back. But at that very first dinner, something happened. Those of you who have read my first volume know that the young Lady Bird Johnson was not at all the poised, gracious, dignified First Lady that we have come to know, that she was incredibly shy. She once told me, she was a very bright student in high school, and she once said that she prayed that if she finished first or second in her class, she prayed that she wouldn't finish first or second in her class, because then she would be valedictorian and salutatorian and have to give a speech. She told me that I prayed that if I finished first or second, I would get smallpox. I wrote she would rather face the scars than have to speak in public. And somehow at this, a friend in Austin, when Lyndon Johnson, not only could she not speak for her husband when he started to run for Congress, but she couldn't even be a hostess with any ease at in Texas, of course, we called them coffees, that the wives of candidates used to hold for the women in the district to meet the candidate's wife. A friend said to me, to watch Lady Bird stand in a receiving line at a coffee with that smile etched on her face as if it was set in stone was the most painful thing I ever saw. And somehow Sam Rayburn, this very shy man, saw in this very shy woman something that made his heart go out to him, and a very paternal fondness sprung up between them, a protective fondness. If you go to the big living room at the Johnson Ranch on the Pedernales, there is only one portrait of a human being in that living room. It's of Sam Rayburn. It was put there not by Lyndon Johnson, but by Lady Bird. But Rayburn's love came to extend to Lyndon Johnson. In 1934, that same year, Lady Bird is back in Texas visiting her father, and Lyndon gets pneumonia, which of course in those days was a very serious thing. Rayburn sat next to his bed in the hospital in a straight-backed wooden chair all evening, and all night, rather. He was a chain smoker, but he was so afraid that if he brushed the cigarette ashes off his vest and his lapel, he would wake Lyndon Johnson, that he didn't want to move all night. So when Lyndon got up in the morning, he remembered that Sam Rayburn was covered with cigarette ashes on his chest. And Lyndon Johnson also remembered that as soon as Rayburn saw he was awake, he leaned over him and said, "Lyndon, never worry about anything again. If you need anything, call on me." Well, Lyndon Johnson being Lyndon Johnson, it was not very long before he did call on him for some reason. Franklin Roosevelt had just created a New Deal agency, the National Youth Administration. There was going to be a state director for each state. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be the director for Texas. There was no reason in the world that anyone would give him that job. He was a congressman's assistant. His administrative experience was zero. There's a remarkable passage in the memoirs of the old Texas Senator Tom Connolly, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He says, "An amazing thing happened today. Everybody knows that Sam Rayburn never asks a man for a favor. But today Sam Rayburn came to my office and asked for a favor and would not leave until I gave it to him." The favor, of course, was that Connolly use his power with Roosevelt to get the NYA directorship for Texas for Lyndon Johnson. He does, and Johnson's career is on its way. As those of you who have read my books know, that relationship between Johnson and Rayburn had its ups and downs. For 3 years, it was a falling out because Johnson betrayed Rayburn at one point. But when Johnson goes off to war at Pearl Harbor, I wrote that Sam Rayburn's heart melted in a moment as a father's heart melts to a son who is in danger. The day that he leaves for the Pacific, Lyndon Johnson writes Sam Rayburn a letter. Rayburn folds that letter up and puts it in his wallet. He carried it around in his wallet for 20 years until the day he died in 1961, when his executors came to inventory the contents of his wallet. There was the letter from Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson realizes, as soon as he comes to the Senate, this man who knows where to look for power, that he possesses something that no other senator, no matter how powerful, possesses. He is the only man who can go to the Speaker of the House and ask for something and know that he's going to get it. Of course, senators need something from the House. Just if you need a dam for your district, your state, it's not enough to have the Senate authorize it. The House has to authorize it. If you're doing something with legislation, the House can change it. Then you have to reconcile it. And you see an awareness of this coming just almost within months after Lyndon Johnson comes to the Senate. You see letters from very powerful senators, committee chairmen saying, Lyndon, my dam authorization seems to be stalled in the House. Could you put a word in the Speaker's ear? Or Lyndon, the House is marking up, House Ways and Means is marking up my appropriations bill incorrectly. Could you say something to Mr. Sam? And of course, Lyndon Johnson, whenever he did such a favor for a senator, made sure that he knew it, and begins to accumulate power that way. There's so many other ways that he finds. Maybe I can sum up another one in one sentence because it's easy to understand. It's cash, campaign contributions. Johnson realizes with his political genius that he also possesses something, can possess something that no one else has. He can make himself the only conduit between the Texas natural gas and oil men and the senators and representatives in Washington who need campaign contributions. He makes sure that they contribute only through him. The senators and representatives come to understand there's a source of vast new campaign financing in Washington, and it's this brand new freshman senator who controls it. If you wanted to sum it up in one sentence, one of his lawyers walks into the Johnson Ranch House during some election when a lot of senators are running, and Johnson is sitting with not one phone but two phones up to his ears, and he's saying, I've got 20 for him and 20 for him and 30 for him. So Johnson used these powers with a ruthlessness that made them even more effective. Ruthlessness creates power. Fear creates power in itself. Here is another quote about Lyndon Johnson, speaking about himself. I'm just like a fox. I can see the jugular in any man and go for it. But I always keep myself in rein. I keep myself on a leash, just like you would an animal. Well, that self-assessment is only partly true. There are more than a few examples in this book of how Lyndon Johnson let himself off the leash. In that same very first year in the Senate, in fact, he saw the jugular in a man and destroyed him with what he saw. The man was named Leland Olds. He was the chairman of the Federal Power Commission. Olds was a very idealistic old liberal and a New Dealer. He had worked for Franklin Roosevelt in New York, and Roosevelt raised him to the head of the New York State Power Authority. When Roosevelt came to Washington, he wanted the same type of man as head of the Federal Power Commission because, as Olds said, who owns the river if it's not the people? Olds believed that natural gas companies and companies that had natural resources could make profits, but just because they monopolized them, the profits could not become exorbitant. When Johnson comes to Washington, the natural gas industry is being restrained from the profits they want by Olds. So Johnson's first assignment, Olds is now up for renomination for a new 5-year term as head of the Federal Power Commission, is to defeat that renomination. It's very hard to do because most of the Senate had worked with Olds, and even the conservative senators admired him. But Johnson found his jugular. He learns that during the 1920s, 25, 30 years before, Leland Olds had been a reporter for a wire service. A wire service is like the Associated Press or the United Press. His was called the Federated Press. It had 80 subscribers, newspapers that printed his articles. Most of them were mainstream newspapers, a few were union newspapers, but one was the Communist Daily Worker. Olds didn't work for it, they just reprinted his article. Johnson has his assistants go through every issue of the Daily Worker during the 1920s, and he finds 54 cases in which the byline by Leland Olds appears in the Daily Worker. He has those pages photocopied and bound together. He takes them around to other senators and holds hearings on them and convinces senators that Olds wrote for the Daily Worker and was a communist. He was successful. In his final speech on the Senate on this nomination, Johnson's climactic line, which is somehow left out of most Lyndon Johnson biographies, is, "What do we want? A commissioner or a commissar?" Olds loses. He never gets another job in government, another decent job in government. He can't get a job anywhere. He's only 58 years old in the industry that he wants, because who would dare employ a communist? He didn't have much savings, so he lived the rest of his life as a poor man. There were worse things. His wife couldn't believe that the friends in this little neighborhood where they had lived in Washington for so many years, who had been her friends, wouldn't talk to him anymore because they were afraid to be seen talking to a communist. And her life from then on was a series of nervous breakdowns. For all the scenes that were very painful for me to write in this book, one, the most painful, I think, takes place right outside the hearing room where Johnson, as chairman of the subcommittee on Olds, has just destroyed this man. Olds knows he's been destroyed, and he's standing outside in the corridor with his wife and one assistant during a recess. And Lyndon Johnson comes out. He puts his arm around his shoulders. He says, "Lee, we're still friends, aren't we? There's nothing personal in this, you know. It's just politics." Well, that was politics, part of Lyndon Johnson's style of politics, and it was very effective. After that Olds episode, a lot of senators were a little wary of this freshman, a little afraid of him. And of course, fear, as I said, creates more power. As the leader, we see in this book the same ruthlessness. Even men who were pragmatic in Washington, who thought they had seen everything, who thought they were used to the pragmatism of politics in Washington, saw there was something special about Lyndon Johnson. The senator and former representative Scoop Jackson explained once the difference between President Kennedy and President Johnson. Kennedy would explain precisely why this is Jackson's quote. Kennedy would explain precisely why a bill was so important and why he needed the senator's support. But if the senator said his constituency just wouldn't let him vote that way, Kennedy would finally say he was sorry they couldn't agree, but he understood. Lyndon Johnson, Scoop Jackson would say, and Jackson worked closely with Johnson for 25 years, Lyndon Johnson wouldn't understand. He would refuse to understand. He would, these are Jackson's words, he would charm you or knock your block off or bribe you or threaten you, anything he had to get your vote. And he'd get it. That was the difference. He'd get it. So when Lyndon Johnson becomes leader, he had the powers he had found and created and the ruthlessness with which he used them. And during those 6 years, 1955 to 1960, that he was majority leader, the Senate was really led by Lyndon Johnson. It was run by Lyndon Johnson. He really ran it. He'd see a senator come in from the cloakroom door and sit down at a couch in the back of the chamber. He'd rush up to the back of the chamber, throw himself down on the couch, put the arm around the shoulder, grab the lapel, and start talking to him. Another senator would come in across the chamber. Johnson would be up, rushing across the chamber, and he'd sort of pin the senator against the wall where he talked to him. His eyes missed nothing. He was always at the door to the Republican cloakroom would swing open. And he'd see a Republican senator whose vote he was sure he had was talking to one of President Eisenhower's White House liaison men in a suspiciously friendly manner. Had he lost that vote, he'd be rushing over to the cloakroom to wait till the senator came on the floor to see if he still had that vote or if he needed another one. In my book, I describe Lyndon Johnson in the moments before a vote on a major but relatively non-controversial bill. With the vote all but upon him now, he seemed always to be in motion. And the motions would get faster, almost frenzied. As he talked to senators, his hands never stopped moving, gesturing expressively, chopping the air with that snake-killing gesture, opening a palm to illustrate a point, punching the air with a fist, jabbing a lapel with a finger, patting a senator's shoulder, straightening his tie, grabbing his lapel, hugging him if he agreed to the proposition being made. If he dropped down into his own front row center chair, he might sit down in it, stretching out both long legs across the aisle, or lean far back, crossing them. But he wouldn't stay in any pose long, crossing and uncrossing his legs, leaning back in his chair with a hand up to his face as he whispered to Russell close behind him, or to a senator who had approached with information or an inquiry, pulling out a tally sheet, writing something on it, tucking it back in his pocket. He seemed simply unable to sit still for a moment. And that was on a minor, non-controversial bill. On a bill on which the vote was going to be close, and the result of genuine political significance, the frenzy of Lyndon Johnson's actions escalated another notch. As the moment approached for the roll call, the call that would determine the actual, irrevocable winning or losing for this man who had to win, Lyndon Johnson's orders grew sharper, more punctuated with fury. There was no more, "Sure, I understand." Now he said, "I need that vote. Get him in here." He did things you can hardly believe. He once kicked Hubert Humphrey in the shins when Humphrey didn't move fast enough for him, and when Humphrey still wasn't moving faster, he kicked him in the other shins. I learned about this from a column by the reporter Robert S. Allan. Allan wrote, "I thought Humphrey must be exaggerating," until he added, "Look," and he pulled up his trouser leg, and sure enough, he had some scars there. He had a couple of scars on his shins where Lyndon Johnson had kicked him and said, "Get going." You know, he would use these lapels. We know it as a cliche that he grabbed the lapels, but he would really grab them. There was this diminutive senator from Rhode Island, John Pastore, who I think was only 5'6". Johnson went over to him and took one of Pastore's lapels in each hand, stood him up on his toes, and held him against the wall while he delivered his argument. Sometimes he was afraid that a senator would pull away from him even if he had the lapel, so he did something else. Oh, well, in those days, men's lapels had buttonholes in them. So Johnson would stick his finger through the buttonhole in the lapel so that the guy couldn't get away without leaving the buttonhole behind. The leader was hurrying back and forth across the chamber, prowling the aisles, charging up the stairs to the cloakroom, and then suddenly the moment was at hand, the moment for which he had been waiting. The number of votes on the tally sheet was at last the number he needed. He would win if nothing changed. So what he would do is something that we would just think incredible today. This is how he ran the Senate, like an orchestra conductor conducting an obedient orchestra. His desk as majority leader was the front row center desk. The dais in the Senate is very low, then you have the well, and then the first row, which is raised 6 inches. So when Johnson, who was 6'4", stands at it, his eyes are almost at the level of the senator in the presiding chair. Johnson would prompt him. If someone wanted to offer an amendment, Johnson would whisper, "No more amendments." If the guy didn't say no more amendments, he'd say, "No more amendments." And the presiding officer would say, "Amendments out of order." Call the question. Call the question. The question would be called. Yeas and nays have been ordered. The clerk will call the roll. And with those last words, the words that signaled the actual vote, the power of Lyndon Johnson as majority leader was fully revealed. For during the 6 years of his leadership, the Senate of the United States presented during close and crucial votes a spectacle such as had never been seen before during the century and a half of its existence. If he had just enough votes, and he was often operating with a one-vote majority, he wanted that vote called and fast while he had them. So what he would do is he would stand at his desk and raise his hand over his head, and like a mechanic or an orchestra leader, he would go like this, and the clerk would call the roll fast. If he didn't have enough votes, if his men were still working on a senator in the cloakroom, or if someone was being rushed to the Capitol by the police, he wanted it slow, so he'd go like this. And that was how the voting was done in the Senate then. Hugh Sidey remembered years later the tall man with his mind attuned to every sight and sound and parliamentary nuance. He signaled the roll call faster and slower. He gave another signal and the door opened and 2 more guys would run in. My God, running the world, power enveloped him. And what did he do with that power? As you will see from this book, he broke the dam that was the Senate. He forced the Senate, he forced through the Senate liberal legislation that had been stalled in it for decades, and succeeded in passing in 1957 the first civil rights bill in 82 years against seemingly insurmountable odds. The life of Lyndon Johnson is, to me, a very poignant life. The story of his boyhood is just sad, poignant, and so is a lot of the rest of his life. But his time in the Senate was not sad, which makes that, in a way, the most poignant thing of all, because he wasn't content to stay there, but wanted something else, which he got. Lady Bird was to say in her diary, "Those 12 years in the Senate were the happiest 12 years of our lives." And they were. Lyndon Johnson was born to be there. And for the United States, they were productive years. When you look back at the Senate of the United States during the first 2.25 centuries of its existence, after the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun, the Senate worked, really, only during one period, a 6-year period, 1955 through 1960, in which Lyndon Johnson was its leader. It really worked then. Lyndon Johnson was indeed what I call him, master of the Senate. Well, I tried to keep this short, but if I could do things short, I wouldn't always be writing 1,000-page books. Thank you very much.
I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. One of my roles as moderator was to keep things moving and on time. We've run over a bit, but it's, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, once you pick up his book, you won't be able to put it down. And listening to him, I couldn't try to keep it on time. He was just too eloquent, as indicated by your tremendous applause. I think it'd be great to have a few questions. We're really very late as far as the program goes, but I'm going to take 3 questions, and Mr. Caro's agreed to respond to them.
Okay. Anyone have a question?
Yes, Bob. This is Rick Cox from Dallas, Texas, and I was curious if you could say a word or two about working with your editor, Bob Gottlieb.
About working with my editor, Bob Gottlieb? Well, Bob Gottlieb has been my editor for 30 years. You know, I'm one of these, look, I've had the same editor, the same publishing house, the same agent. One interesting thing is that he and I still are, he edits in pencil and I write in pencil. And when we were editing this book, we would be sitting there, the 2 of us working with a pencil on the manuscript, and the younger editors would walk by the office and do double takes, and then they'd come back to watch the 2 old schmucks working with a pencil.
Second question.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask, some other writers who focused on Johnson have dealt quite extensively with his role in the space program, the hearings in 1958 after Sputnik, and the role he played in shaping some of Kennedy's policies. You didn't really touch it in your book in any degree, and I was wondering why and what your take was on that.
Well, I did touch it. I go into it. I'm going to talk about the space program more in the next book, because it's when he's vice president that the things that he started in the Senate came to fruition, so I thought it would fit better there. Yes, sir.
This might be getting a little ahead of what your talk was on, but how much of Johnson's policies as president do you think were actually shaped by JFK's previous policies, and do you think Johnson ever really had his own presidency, or was he really continuing JFK's?
No, I think that Johnson, well, it's a very good question, and you can't answer it in a short way. I'll just say in a short way that what Johnson did in civil rights, I'm not sure that we would have today the civil rights bills that he passed in 1964 and 1965, if it hadn't been Lyndon Johnson in the White House. His presidency was very much his own. It shaped America in many ways, both for good and for, in some ways, not for good. But the Great Society was really Johnson's own. You can say, and I guess this is what you mean, that all these things were sort of an outgrowth and a continuation of legislation that had been proposed by Roosevelt and then by Truman and then by Kennedy. And that's true. But, you know, there really comes a point where you need something special to get it through. When you look at the power of the Senate, when I was writing about the Civil Rights Bill in 1957, and Johnson sets out to get that first Civil Rights Bill through, it really seemed impossible to me that anyone could get it through the Senate. The South had all the power in the Senate. There were 9 very powerful standing committees in 57, if I have that number right. Southerners were chairman of 8 of them. They were determined that no bill was going to pass. To watch Johnson do it is to watch something unique, legislative genius, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Robert Caro walking over to our cameras to begin taking your phone calls. If you would like to join us, he will be able to join us and takes a few phone calls from you. Eastern and Central Time Zone 202-585-3880. Mountain and Pacific Time Zone 202-585-3881. Here's what's coming up in the next couple hours. After our call-in program with Robert Caro, we will be changing the discussion a little bit, but to the same era. A discussion about the Vietnam era. We have 3 writers who are going to be joining us, and historians. Michael Beschloss, who has written a lot about LBJ and specifically about the LBJ tapes. He'll be a part of this panel. Also, novelist Tim O'Brien, who spent some time in Vietnam, but also has a new novel out called July, July, which is about Vietnam. And Michael Lind, who has written a book called Vietnam, the Necessary War, a reinterpretation of America's most disastrous military conflict. This next panel will be moderated by Bill Broyles, who is the author of Brother in Arms. Following that program, which will be at approximately 1 hour, Mr. Lind and Mr. O'Brien have both agreed to take your phone calls about their writings and about the Vietnam era. So all of that will be coming up. We also will be bringing you live coverage tomorrow on C-SPAN and Book TV, more from the Texas Book Festival, which is taking place in Austin, Texas, all this weekend. Beginning at noon Eastern Time, we'll have a panel discussion called Magnificent Obsessions. You're going to see a gentleman by the name of H.W. Brands, who has written, his latest book is about the California Gold Rush. And also on the panel, John Tolliver. John Tolliver has a new book out. It is called Great White Fathers, and it's the story of Gutzon Borglum, the man who was the sculptor for Mount Rushmore. At about 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow afternoon, H.W. Brands will take your calls, again talking about the gold rush. And then that will be followed by a panel on the Alamo, and after that, a panel on Enron. Now we're joined by Robert Caro, who is in the House chamber of the Texas State House. Hello, Mr. Caro.
Good morning.
You had mentioned earlier about that room and about Lyndon Johnson and his father. About what time period are we talking about there?
Well, it would be when Johnson was 9 and 10 and 11 years old, about 19, 18, 19, and 20. You know, his father was a very effective populist legislator. The thing that intrigued me was what I touched on, that everyone knew Lyndon Johnson's habit of grabbing a man's lapels and putting his arm around the shoulder, and that was his father's habit in the House.
You know, you have 2 full pages of pictures of this buttonholing in your book, and we're showing some of those pictures to our viewers right now. You say that he learned it right in that room.
Well, he either learned it or inherited it. It's apparently a family trait. He was very much like his father in that regard.
Let's take some phone calls for you. Worcester, Ohio. Hello.
Hello. Mr. Caro.
Yes.
I've enjoyed
Yes,
your
sir.
first couple of volumes on Johnson. Looking
Thank
forward
you.
to your one on the presidency and vice presidency, of course. But I've always been intrigued by the relationship of LBJ and J. Edgar Hoover. And you talked about power earlier. How do you think that Mr. Hoover affected Johnson's version of power and how he used it down the road, especially as president? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question. Of course, Hoover and Johnson lived diagonally across the street from each other and were friends in Washington for many years. I have to take a pass on that question because I haven't finished my research on it. It's part of the next volume.
And speaking of that research, how's it going?
Well, I've started it here. I went to the Johnson Library the last few days and got an overview of how much presidential papers there are that I have to go through. So right at this moment, I feel a little overwhelmed.
Portland, Oregon, you're next. Go ahead.
Hi. Hey, I've really enjoyed your work, Mr. Caro. I wanted to ask if you would make a judgment, and I understand you're still researching, but where would you rank Johnson among the greatest presidents of our country? And my own is Abraham Lincoln. And would you mind making a judgment on that?
Well, I would say, without saying how great he was certainly one of the presidents who whose presidency changed America the most. You know, when I look at the presidency of the whole American history in the 20th century, Lyndon Johnson is a watershed. And I use that in the exact meaning of that word. A watershed is a mountain divide. On one side, the waters run one way, on the other side, they run the other way. America was a different place when Lyndon Johnson became president in 1963 than it was when he left the presidency in 1969. And the job that I have in the last volume is to try and figure out exactly why that happened.
Atlanta, Georgia. Hello.
Yeah, Mr. Caro, thank you very much for all the work you have done over the years on behalf of we Americans. I have a specific question about Clinton Anderson.
Yes, sir.
In the Civil Rights Amendment,
yes,
LBJ is prowling around the Senate. He comes up to the back to Clinton Anderson's desk, and Anderson is eliminating Part 3, which is basically what LBJ had to get through to get the Civil Rights Amendment. Now, it seems to now I can see LBJ's behavioral trait doing that, but what I can't see is the just a fortuitous and total serendipitous event that Anderson happened to be working on exactly what LBJ needed at that time. it seemed like some sort of a cosmic intervention.
Well, what was significant to me, I see you've read the book very closely, that to me is an example of one aspect of legislative genius, where the floor is crowded with senators, Southerners, and liberals yelling at each other. There seems to be no way out. The Republican leader, William Noland, is about to call for a vote which is going to lose, and that's going to be the end of the civil rights fight. And Johnson suddenly notices that Anderson, who is not one of the more militant liberals, was a man that everyone respected in the Senate, is doing something at his desk. Johnson walks over and sees in one instant that it is, as you say, just what he needs it. And he says, introduce it. Anderson looks up at him. I don't think I can remember the exact words that are in my book. And he says, I can't do that. I'm a civil rights man, because this would have weakened the bill, but weakened it in such a way that it could have gotten through. And Johnson, in an instant, sees how Anderson can do it and not be tagged as an anti-civil rights senator, and persuades him to do it. That's legislative genius.
Willits, California.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Caro about...
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you how Lyndon Johnson viewed the Constitution in wartime. I'm actually thinking of the present day when the U.S. Patriot Act virtually eclipses the Constitution, and there really isn't a war. So I wonder if you could give some perspective on Johnson and the Constitution.
Well, without relating it specifically to a war or even to today, sir, I would say that Johnson, from the time he first went to Washington, had a very broad concept, a broad interpretation of executive authority, of presidential power. He really believed in that.
Next call is New York City. Hello, New York City.
Hi there. My question
is,
I'm a black woman born in the early 50s.
Yes, ma'am.
And the country that I was born into is greatly different from the country as it is now. Therefore, I attribute my life and what I have to two presidents, Lincoln and Johnson. My question is, how did a Southerner end up risking alienating Dixiecrats? How was he able to effect such change, and what was his motivation for wanting to do that? Because he didn't have to. Even liberals didn't want to take on that, and yet my life is greatly changed by the things that Lyndon Johnson did. Why him? How a Southerner did that?
Well, I so agree with you. You know, I wrote in this book that Lincoln struck off the shackles of the slaves. But it was Lyndon Johnson who took the hand of African Americans, led them into the voting booth, closed democracy's curtain behind them, and gave them, for the first time, the power that they had been promised. As to his motivations, they are so complex. You know, I have a line in the book. I said his passions were no less powerful because they were opposite. I think that a part of Johnson truly wanted to help people of color, and he had wanted to help people of color since he was a 21-year-old school teacher in a Mexican-American town down in Cotulla, Texas. And I wrote, no other teacher had ever cared if these children learned or not. This teacher cared. He really wanted to help. At the same time, when you say, when did he start to help, it was at a point where the compassion, I call that compassion, and his ambition finally were pointing in the same direction. Because in 1957, he realizes that he has to defuse Northern anger against him by passing a civil rights bill. So they're very complex motivations, but part of them, in my opinion, was pure.
Robert Caro, thank you very much for joining us and taking some of our viewer calls on Book TV this afternoon.
Thank you.
We're just going to introduce you to who the people are. Michael Beschloss, the historian, Tim O'Brien, who is a novelist and writes a lot about Vietnam.
Excellence by scholars, politicians, critics, and the public at large. The first volume of this trilogy, The Path to Power, won the National Book Critics Circle Award as the best nonfiction work of 1982. The second volume, Means of Ascent, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for 1990. And the third volume, Master of the Senate, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, is a finalist for a National Book Award in the nonfiction category. The winner will be announced November 20th, and I'm sure you join me in wishing Mr. Caro well. Time does not allow mentioning even a fraction of Mr. Caro's many talents and accomplishments, but I would like to comment on Mr. Caro's writing style, because it is absolutely brilliant. Even for those of us who lived through the LBJ years and know most of what happened during this era, this engaging biography brings all the events alive in such a readable way that I strongly advise against picking up a volume unless you can get lost in reading for a while.
Okay. Then my book tour must be over, and that's something to be happy about. And it's trying to decide what to talk about this evening. I had a chance to think back over the book the last couple of days and think about some of the things that I had learned during the course of it and that I had really forgotten during the years, and that I'm really happy to have a chance to remember. One of the things I had forgotten, and it's what I'm going to talk about tonight, was my attempt to examine Lyndon Johnson's career in the Senate. And that is really the reason that my book grew and grew till it became so long, and in fact, the number of books in my biography had to change. You know what Winston Churchill said when they asked him how he was coming on his biography of Lord Marlborough? He said, "I'm working on the 4th of a projected 3 volumes." Well, that's, I'm not to compare myself with Churchill, but I'm in the same boat. So really this talk this afternoon is about how I got there. From the beginning of my work on Lyndon Johnson, of course, I always knew that the section dealing with his 12 years in the United States Senate would be not only about, let's see, is this okay? When my first book on Lyndon Johnson came out in 1982, I remember I gave a talk in Texas where I said that I was always much more happy writing than speaking, that I was always more comfortable at my desk with my typewriter than standing up talking in public. And I told a story about a young rabbi, and I'm going to repeat it today because I still feel the same way, although I've given a lot of talks since then. There was this young rabbi, Jewish like me, who just has graduated from rabbinical school, and he's assigned as his first assignment to be the assistant rabbi at a large metropolitan congregation. And after about a month, the senior rabbi says, "Next Friday night, you're going to give your first sermon." And the young rabbi says, "Well, you know, I have to tell you, I always get very nervous when I have to speak in public. Do you have any advice for me?" And the older rabbi says, "Well, you know, you're allowed to have a water glass up there on the pulpit with you, and I find it helps if I fill it with a dry martini." And the young rabbi takes the advice and gives the sermon, and after the sermon, he hurries to the back of the synagogue, and he says to the older rabbi, "Well, how'd I do?" The older rabbi says, "Well, I have 3 comments to make." He says, "First of all, when I told you you could fill that water glass with a martini and have it up on the pulpit in front of the whole congregation, I didn't mean you should leave the olives in it." And he said, "Second, I suggested that you sip the martini at crucial points in your sermon, not drink the entire thing in one huge gulp at the beginning. And third, David slew Goliath. He didn't beat the shit out of him." Having said that, however, this talk this afternoon is one I'm really happy to give. For one thing, it's really fitting to talk in here because when Lyndon Johnson was a young boy, his father, who was a member of the House, used to bring him to this very room. And Lyndon always had the habit, which he learned from his father. His father on the floor would always put that hand around the shoulder and grab the lapel. And Lyndon Johnson started doing that when he was still a boy. And I'm also happy because if I'm here speaking, that must mean that my book tour is over. And let me just try to arrange this a little better. Can you all hear me now? This okay? No? Okay. Can you all hear me now? How about now?
While I can assure you that you won't put it down easily. Mr. Caro, a Princeton graduate, spent 6 years as an award-winning investigative reporter for Newsday. To research the years of Lyndon B. Johnson, Mr. Caro and Ina, who is his research assistant and his wife, moved to the Texas Hill Country. He spent years examining documents of Lyndon B. Johnson at the Presidential Library and interviewing people who had some connection to Johnson's life. For the 3rd volume, Mr. Caro spent weeks in the United States Senate talking to hundreds of people so that he could possibly accurately present this critical period in Johnson's career. Though I could go on about Mr. Caro, I suspect that you came here today to hear him speak about his own work. So at this time, I would like to ask you to give a warm welcome to Robert A. Caro.
Well, when my first book on Lyndon Johnson came out,